Before we begin, imagine the world going quiet around you. The flicker of torchlight, the smell of wood smoke, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer at dusk. It is the year 1283. You are not a knight or a noble, but someone far more common, a farmer, a washerwoman, a stable boy, a mother with 7 children. In modern life, we take for granted certain things: privacy, hygiene, comfort. We think of intimacy as something quiet, personal, soft. But in the medieval world, sex was anything but simple. It was tightly controlled by the church. It was dictated by the calendar, and it often happened in cold, shared spaces where your own children or your animals might be just feet away. This is not a story of romance. It is not a tale of courtly love or grand passion. This is the quiet, uncomfortable, often forgotten history of physical life in the Middle Ages. In this segment, we'll slowly unravel what intimacy really looked like for ordinary people in medieval Europe. Not the fantasy, not the filtered version, but the textures, the rhythms, the rules, and the realities. Breathe in slowly. We're about to travel back not to a time of shining armor, but to scratchy straw beds and whispered prayers for forgiveness. Welcome to the world of the medieval peasant. The fantasy of castles and candlelit romances quickly fades when you step into a small, smoky hut somewhere in 13th century rural France or England. This is not a place of whispered passions or stolen kisses. It is a world shaped by necessity, religion, weather, and survival. And when it comes to sex and intimacy, things were far from private, let alone pleasurable. One room for everything. Most medieval peasants lived in simple, one-room dwellings. This single space served every purpose. It was your kitchen, your sleeping quarters, your nursery, your livestock pen, and, yes, your bedroom. You, your spouse, your children, and possibly your in-laws all lived together under one low, thatched roof. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. At one end of the room might be a hearth with a low fire, providing heat and smoke that hung in the air. At the other end, animals, goats, chickens, maybe even a pig might be sleeping, especially in winter. In between, bundles of straw or a raised wooden platform served as a bed. Beds made of straw and scraps forget mattresses, sheets, or pillows. Peasants slept on straw stuffed into cloth sacks, if they were lucky, or directly on heaps of hay covered with old textiles. Beds were low to the ground, scratchy, and shared. A couple might sleep beside one or more children, or even servants. In colder regions, even livestock could be brought indoors to add warmth and to survive the night. The bedding materials themselves were rarely washed. They might be infested with lice, fleas, or mites. The smell of unwashed bodies mingled with animal dung, smoke, and the scent of fermented food or spilled ale. This was the olfactory backdrop of medieval life. The clothing never came off. For most peasants, clothing was limited and precious. A person might own just 1 or 2 woolen tunics and a linen undergarment. These were worn day and night, and they were not easy to remove. Getting undressed fully was inconvenient and, in many seasons, uncomfortable or even dangerous. Many couples had sex without fully removing their clothes. They might simply lift a tunic or loosen a belt. In colder months, getting completely undressed was not only impractical, but risky to one's health. And since people bathed infrequently, clothing offered a small buffer against contact with unwashed skin. Witnesses were common. It was not unusual for others to be present during intimate moments. Children might be asleep nearby, and servants or extended family might be within earshot or eyesight. In some cases, especially among the lower classes, there was little choice. The space did not allow for separation, and the notion that sex required privacy was not universally assumed. In fact, certain rituals made sexual exposure a communal affair. In parts of Europe, newlyweds might be escorted to their bed by family and neighbors, who would wait to ensure that the marriage was consummated. Sometimes, symbolic items were displayed to prove that intercourse had taken place. Hygiene was a luxury. Bathing was rare among peasants. Soap was expensive, and water often had to be hauled long distances. Instead, people wiped themselves with cloths, used herbal rinses, or went without. Dental hygiene was virtually non-existent. Body odors were not just common, they were inescapable. This does not mean that people were unaware of smell or entirely indifferent. In medieval literature, characters often comment on the odors of others, especially when mocking peasants or foreigners. But the reality remained: washing was difficult, and most people lived with the smells of their own and others' bodies every day. Emotional detachment and physical routine. In such conditions, sex often became a functional act, rather than an emotional or sensual one. With the church's constant warnings against lust and excessive pleasure, many people likely viewed intimacy as a duty, something done to produce children or fulfill marital obligations. For women, it could also be a source of fear or danger, especially given the risk of pregnancy and childbirth. There were, of course, exceptions. Not every couple was unhappy or unfulfilled. Love existed, even tenderness. But the context in which intimacy occurred was so vastly different from our own that romantic notions must be reconsidered. The physical environment shaped the emotional one, a soundtrack of real life. Forget silence and candlelight. The soundtrack to medieval intimacy was likely a mix of coughing children, clucking hens, the creaking of a wooden bed, and perhaps the drunken song of a neighbor next door. The fire crackled, the wind howled through the cracks in the wall, and the animals stirred restlessly. Even in castles, privacy was rare. Curtains might be drawn around a bed, but servants still moved freely. Royalty had more space, better bedding, and greater comfort, but they too were subject to the rhythms of a communal, hierarchical society. Conclusion: the quiet struggle of intimacy. To understand what sex was really like in medieval times, one must first discard the assumptions of modern life. There was no room of one's own, no expectation of privacy, and little awareness of personal space. Intimacy occurred within the constraints of survival, religion, and space. It was a world of physical necessity, not fantasy. Yet within these limits, people still found connection, perhaps not often in comfort or passion, but in shared struggle and moments of closeness amid the noise and dirt of medieval life. Imagine wanting to be close to your spouse, only to remember it's the third Sunday after Pentecost, which means the act is forbidden. In medieval Europe, sex wasn't just a private matter. It was a matter of divine regulation. Every moan, every movement, every moment was framed by the looming shadow of the church. Sex as sin, even in marriage. The church believed sex was inherently sinful, a necessary evil allowed only for reproduction. Even between married couples, pleasure was frowned upon. Any act not intended for procreation could be considered a sin, and marital intimacy became a carefully monitored ritual. Medieval clergy taught that sex was tolerable only when performed under strict conditions. The couple must be married. The wife must not be menstruating or pregnant. The act must be solely for the purpose of having children. If there was even a hint of enjoyment, guilt often followed. Sex was not a form of bonding. It was, at best, tolerated, and at worst, dangerous to the soul. The forbidden days, over 100 days a year, were considered inappropriate or outright sinful for sexual activity. These included Sundays, all feast days of saints, all of Lent, 40 days Advent, another 40 days, the 3 days before Easter, days leading up to Communion, Wednesdays and Fridays in many regions. Some scholars estimate that more than half the calendar year was off limits for sexual contact. That left a surprisingly small and unpredictable window for lawful, guilt-free intimacy. Couples often went weeks or even months without engaging in sex, not because they didn't want to, but because they feared eternal damnation. Penitentials, the manuals of morality to guide priests in monitoring the sexual behavior of their flock. Church authorities developed penitentials, detailed handbooks that assigned penance to specific sins, often with astonishing precision. Examples from surviving texts include sex during menstruation, 3 years of fasting or abstinence, wrong position, i.e., anything other than missionary, 1 to 5 years of penance, sex on a feast day, 40 days of penance, oral sex, 7 years, or permanent exclusion from communion. Masturbation or unnatural acts ranged from 7 to 15 years, sometimes with public penance. These were not metaphorical punishments. Believers were expected to follow through, fasting, avoiding church sacraments, sometimes even sleeping on the ground or wearing rough clothing in humility, confession and anxiety. These complex, shifting rules created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. People feared that even their most natural desires might condemn them. Sex that had once been spontaneous or joyful was now loaded with anxiety. Confession became not just a moral act, but a psychological burden. Imagine kneeling before your parish priest and being asked in detail when, how, and why you last slept with your spouse. For women especially, this meant a loss of dignity and autonomy, as priests often took the role of sexual enforcers. Some penitents became obsessive, confessing every thought, dream, or moment of arousal. Others fell into guilt-ridden silence, believing they were too impure to speak. The role of clergy, ironically, while peasants and townsfolk bore the weight of these teachings, the clergy themselves often broke them. Priests were required to remain celibate, but many did not. Some had long-term lovers or fathered children. There are surviving records of bishops fining clergy for maintaining housekeepers, who were, in fact, mistresses. Monasteries were not immune. Scandals involving monks, nuns, and even abbots were common, especially in wealthier or more isolated religious communities. But even when clergy broke the rules, they still enforced them on everyone else, creating a culture of spiritual hypocrisy. Sex as penance and obligation for women. Sex was often portrayed as a marital duty, not a shared experience. Church doctrine taught that wives must not deny their husbands, or they risked causing him to sin elsewhere, and thus bearing some of that blame. In some texts, husbands were told not to force their wives, but in practice, women had few options to refuse. The church promoted virginity and chastity, yet also demanded reproduction. Women were caught in a double bind, required to submit, yet condemned for desiring. Men, too, bore burdens. Excessive desire, even for one's wife, was called lust within marriage and was discouraged. Couples were told not to enjoy each other too much. Passion, even in wedlock, could be seen as a form of moral decay. The calendar shaped the bedroom. The idea that intimacy must align with holy seasons and sacred rhythms made sex feel like a scheduled, fearful obligation. A husband might have to wait until Lent ended. A wife might have to withhold for fear of spiritual impurity. Couples tracked the church's calendar like modern people track fertility, only in reverse. This framework was not just religious, it was cultural. It affected when children were conceived, when weddings were held, and how marital relationships developed. The bed, once a private space, had become a battleground between flesh and faith. Conclusion: guilt in the bedroom. In medieval Europe, sex was rarely about pleasure or connection. It was burdened by rules, shame, and fear. The church loomed not only in cathedrals and sermons, but in the very act of intimacy itself. Couples lived under the constant weight of moral scrutiny, even in the darkness of night, even in the arms of their spouse. Desire was not denied entirely, but it was deeply disciplined. For centuries, the calendar, the confessional, and the penitentials determined when you could love, how you could love, and whether you should even want to love at all. And so, many simply waited, or repressed, or sinned in silence, whispering prayers not for passion, but for forgiveness. Forget roses, proposals, or moonlit walks. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't built on love. It was a contract, a transaction sealed with a handshake, a dowry, or a piece of land. Romance wasn't expected, in most cases. It wasn't even considered. Marriage was an economic agreement in the Middle Ages. Marriage was first and foremost a legal and economic institution. Love was not a prerequisite, not even a bonus. The key concern was property, who had it, who would inherit it, and how to keep it in the family. Among the nobility, this meant forging political alliances. A marriage could prevent war, settle a feud, or secure a border. Among the peasantry, it was more about labor and survival. A good match meant access to farmland, tools, or livestock. The church eventually took over the administration of marriage, but even then, it served the same functions: to regulate inheritance, legitimize children, and reduce social chaos. The age of consent. Younger than you'd think. While the church technically defined the age of consent as 12 for girls and 14 for boys, cultural norms varied. Noble girls were often married by 12, especially if a political alliance needed to be secured. Peasant girls sometimes waited until their mid-teens, though economic need often rushed the timeline. Once betrothed, couples were bound by public promise, and in many parts of Europe, a mutual verbal agreement was all it took to constitute a valid marriage. No ceremony, no witnesses, no clergy, just a spoken yes, followed by consummation. Love came later. Maybe it wasn't impossible for couples to grow fond of each other over time. Many did, but medieval literature makes it clear that this wasn't expected. In fact, romantic love was considered suspicious, even dangerous. To love your spouse too much was seen as a distraction from God. The courtly love celebrated in poems and stories was usually directed at someone else. Wife love as yearning, never fulfillment. The church taught that the ideal marriage was calm, dutiful, and emotionally neutral. Passion was risky. Pleasure was closer to sin than virtue. The marriage ceremony, simple and sparse for much of the Middle Ages. Weddings were shockingly informal. A couple could be married in a field, at their doorway, or even in bed, as long as they expressed consent and intended to live together. By the 13th century, the church began insisting on public ceremonies and witnesses. But even then, it was a modest affair. No white dresses, no rings except among the wealthy, No dancing unless the local lord permitted it. A dowry was often exchanged. For peasants, this might be a goat or a piece of clothing. For nobles, it could be entire villages. Marriage was not about two people. It was about two families negotiating property and power. The bedding ceremony. Once married, the couple's union was often confirmed by a public bedding ritual. In some regions, friends and family would accompany the couple to their shared bed. There might be music, there might be prayers, there might even be witnesses to the act itself, or at least to its immediate aftermath. Why? Because consummation sealed the deal. Without it, the marriage could be annulled. Blood-stained sheets were sometimes shown as proof of virginity. In noble houses, this ritual could be intensely formal. In villages, it might be more jovial, but no less public. This wasn't seen as invasive, it was communal. Assurance that the union was legitimate and binding. Wives had few rights. Once married, a woman's legal identity often merged with her husband's. She could not own property independently, sue in court, or make contracts without his approval. Her role was to manage the household, bear children, and serve her husband's interests. In wealthier homes, this meant running servants, handling domestic budgets, and ensuring lineage. In poorer households, it meant spinning wool, planting crops, feeding animals, and giving birth. Over and over again, refusal of intimacy could be grounds for annulment. In some cases, beating was tolerated if the wife was seen as disobedient. While laws existed to protect women, they were rarely enforced in practice. Annulments and unnatural marriages. The church allowed marriages to be annulled under certain conditions. Non-consummation. Close kinship often discovered conveniently. After the fact, coercion or lack of consent annulment was easier for the rich, especially when political needs changed. For the poor, separation often meant destitution, scandal, or worse, marriages that did not conform to the procreative norm, including same-sex partnerships, or unions with infertile partners, were stigmatized or hidden. Even sexual incompatibility could become the subject of official inquiry. Yes, there were documented church trials in which spouses had to prove their ability to perform sexually, sometimes in front of officials. Intimacy, however unromantic, was legally important. Conclusion: a bed shared, but not always chosen. Marriage in medieval Europe was rarely a private matter. It was a social contract, embedded in law, watched over by church and community, and driven by survival, not sentiment. For many, the wedding night did not mark the beginning of romance, but the start of duty, a shared bed with someone chosen by others. In a world where love was a distant luxury, and yet, people found ways to care, to comfort, to make a home, even without affection as the foundation. In a world of obligation, gentleness was resistance, and in some rare cases, even joy. In medieval Europe, a woman's body was rarely her own. It belonged to her family before marriage, to her husband after, and ultimately to the church. Her purpose was widely understood to be childbearing. Fertility was her value, virginity was her currency, and death in childbirth was always a looming possibility. Endless pregnancies, constant risk. For most medieval women, life was a cycle of conception, childbirth, nursing, and recovery, then starting again. With no reliable contraception, women might bear 6 to 10 children over the course of their lives. Some bore more, but the risks were immense. Infections, prolonged labor, hemorrhaging, and lack of sterile tools made childbirth a dangerous ordeal. Estimates suggest that 1 in every 3 to 5 pregnancies could result in the mother's death, especially among younger or undernourished women. Childbirth wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Many women confessed their sins and prepared for death before going into labor. Priests were often called to deliver last rites as a precaution. Midwives, between reverence and suspicion. In a world without modern medicine, midwives were crucial figures. They delivered babies, tended to postpartum mothers, and administered herbal remedies. They learned through apprenticeship, oral tradition, and experience, not formal education. Midwives held intimate knowledge of women's bodies, and for this, they were both respected and feared. They could ease pain with herbs or prayers. They might help hide a pregnancy or end one quietly. They were called on to baptize infants who seemed unlikely to survive, and in some cases, they performed rudimentary surgeries with knives or cauterizing tools. But their power, especially over life and death, made the church uneasy. In the later Middle Ages, some midwives were accused of witchcraft or heresy, particularly if they were too skilled or too outspoken. Birth control and folk knowledge, though forbidden by church doctrine, folk contraception did exist. Women passed down knowledge in secret. Herbs like pennyroyal, silphium, or rue were known to reduce fertility or induce miscarriage. Other methods included sponges soaked in wine or vinegar, prolonged breastfeeding, or avoiding sex on fertile days. Though fertility cycles were not well understood, the church condemned all of it. To intentionally prevent pregnancy was seen as a form of murder, even if the soul had not yet entered the body. But in practice, many women, especially those too poor to feed another child, took calculated risks. Birth control was never safe, always uncertain, and deeply secretive. The stigma of menstruation and the impure body. The medieval church considered menstruation a sign of impurity. Women on their period were discouraged or outright barred from taking communion or entering sacred spaces. Many believed menstrual blood could cause disease, spoil crops, or sour wine. These taboos were not just superstition, they shaped daily life, limiting women's movements and reinforcing their lower spiritual status. Texts written by male theologians described the female body as leaky, unstable, and dangerous. Even childbirth was framed as a punishment for Eve's original sin. In this view, a woman's ability to give life also made her spiritually suspect. Silence and suffering despite carrying the heaviest physical burden. Women were rarely taught the details of their own bodies. Most were illiterate, forbidden from studying medicine or theology. Their sexual knowledge came from whispers, songs, or stories told by other women. Marital sex could be painful, especially for young girls married early. Refusing a husband could result in punishment or being labeled a bad wife. Seeking pleasure could mark a woman as sinful or deviant. And yet, within these tight constraints, women created networks of knowledge and care. They supported each other in childbirth, passed down recipes, and shared quiet resistance to the roles imposed on them. Infant mortality and grief. Even when births were successful, survival was not guaranteed. Up to half of all children died before the age of 5, due to poor sanitation, malnutrition, or disease. Women were expected to endure this grief without public mourning. In many cases, infants were not baptized if they died too soon, meaning their souls were said to remain in limbo. Stillbirths were common, so were miscarriages. Most women experienced loss repeatedly and silently. Holy mothers and earthly expectations. The Virgin Mary was held up as the ideal woman, pure, obedient, and divinely chosen. But real women were judged by impossible standards, expected to be fertile but modest, nurturing but quiet, present but invisible. Even nuns, who lived outside the reproductive role, were not free from scrutiny. Their spiritual marriage to Christ came with its own rules about chastity, silence, and submission. A woman who couldn't or wouldn't have children was often treated with suspicion, pity, or disdain. Barren women were considered cursed, and widows were vulnerable to exploitation, remarriage, or accusations of witchcraft. Conclusion: strength and silence. For medieval women, the burden of reproduction was not just biological, it was social, spiritual, and political. Their bodies were controlled by husbands, priests, and the fear of divine judgment. And yet, they persevered, through whispered knowledge, midwife alliances, and quiet endurance. Women shaped the continuity of medieval life, not in the spotlight, but in the hidden spaces of hearth, bed, and birthing stool. In a world that gave them little voice, their strength was found in survival, and in the fragile hope that one child, one body, one secret learned in the dark, might one day endure. Medieval society was built on rules written, spoken, and enforced. But wherever there are rules, there are also people breaking them. In the quiet corners of castles, monasteries, and market alleys, sex still found a way, hidden, forbidden, and very human. Same-sex relationships, unnamed but not unseen. The medieval world had no modern language for sexual orientation, but same-sex attraction certainly existed and was often punished. The term sodomy was used broadly and harshly, lumping together acts from oral sex to anything outside procreative norms. Punishments ranged from public penance to execution, depending on place and period. Yet relationships between people of the same sex still happen, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly. In court records, letters between monks hint at emotional, even physical intimacy. Noble women maintained deep, romantic friendships with each other. Some even lived together in widowhood. In some urban centers, records survive of trials for unnatural acts, often including remarkably detailed confessions. These were not gay rites as we know them, but they were glimpses of longing, love, and connection that defied doctrine. The clergy's hidden lives. Priests and monks were required to be celibate. In practice, many were not. By the 14th century, it was common knowledge that clergy kept mistresses and sometimes children. Some even maintained long-term relationships disguised as housekeepers. Monasteries and convents, far from being places of perfect chastity, were sometimes the scenes of sexual scandal. Reports survive of nuns having secret children, abbots accused of visiting brothels, monks maintaining homosexual relationships within the cloister. The church frequently condemned such acts in public, while privately tolerating or quietly relocating the individuals involved. The rules remained unshaken, but in reality, many spiritual leaders lived with double lives. Prostitution, sinful but necessary. Though officially condemned, prostitution was a common and semi-regulated feature of medieval towns. City governments often allowed brothels to operate in designated districts, believing that controlled vice was better than chaos. Prostitutes were expected to wear identifying clothing, often a yellow hood or belt, and they were barred from churches and public festivals. Yet their services were quietly tolerated, even used by students, clergy, and soldiers. For many women, it was a profession of last resort, a way to survive in a world with few options. Widows, orphans, and runaway servants often found themselves working in brothels under harsh conditions. Some brothels were run by women, others were part of larger criminal networks. All were under surveillance, but rarely shut down. Adultery and double standards. Adultery was considered a grave sin, especially for women. A married woman caught with another man could be publicly humiliated, fined, or worse. A man, by contrast, might only face punishment if the woman was married or of high status. Among nobles, adultery could result in loss of property, disinheritance of children. Political fallout. Among peasants, the consequences were often physical, beatings, public shaming, or forced pilgrimages. Still, affairs happened among the elite. Royal courts were full of mistresses and illegitimate children. Among the poor, fleeting romances, secret lovers, and nighttime rendezvous were simply part of life, kept quiet, but not rare. Love and lust in the margins. Beyond marriage, beyond church law, there was another world, one whispered about in taverns, recorded in court scrolls, or hidden in the margins of manuscripts. Erotic illustrations, tucked away in prayer books, depicted monkeys fondling friars or women chasing phallic snails. Folk songs and riddles played with innuendo and flirtation. Carnival and festival days allowed for temporary suspension of rules, a time when gender roles, sexual restraint, and propriety were all turned upside down. These moments did not erase the dominant morality, but they showed that human desire always found expression, even in the cracks of rigid societies. Conclusion. Beneath the surface, human all along, beneath the rules and rituals of medieval life, people were still people. They longed, they touched, they broke rules, quietly or boldly. Sex in the Middle Ages wasn't just about duty and sin, it was also about loneliness, risk, joy, and rebellion. These transgressions, whether whispered in monasteries, sung in taverns, or scribbled in margins, remind us that history is not just made by kings or popes. It is made by the quiet acts of ordinary people, trying to live and love as best they could in a world that often denied them both. In the heart of medieval Paris, under vaulted stone ceilings and candlelit lecture halls, a man of unmatched intellect began to teach. His name was Pierre Abelard, and by the early 12th century, he had already become a legend. Philosopher, logician, theologian, Abelard was a towering figure, known as much for his mind as for his pride. But it was not in the public sphere where his life would reach its most fateful moment. It was in the quiet chambers of a private tutoring job, where he met Heloise. She was young, but not naive, brilliant, articulate, and fiercely independent. Heloise had already gained a reputation among Parisian intellectuals, rare for a woman of her time. She was educated in Latin, philosophy, and classical literature. Living under the guardianship of her uncle, Canon Fulbert, Heloise had been sheltered but not silenced. Fulbert, proud of her abilities, sought the very best tutor for her. He chose Abelard. A meeting of minds. What began as a simple arrangement quickly became something more. Abelard, impressed by Heloise's intellect, found in her a conversational equal, something he rarely encountered, even among fellow scholars. Their lessons stretched late into the evening, filled with discussion not only of rhetoric and theology, but of poetry, language, and thought. Their relationship, at first, was intellectual, but the lines began to blur. As Abelard would later write, her studies were an excuse for seeing her more often, and for Heloise, the attention of the famed philosopher was both exhilarating and dangerous. Paris at this time was a city of contradictions. While cathedrals rose in honor of divine chastity, alleys buzzed with human desire. Publicly, the church governed every aspect of moral life. Privately, passion simmered behind stone walls, for to brilliant minds caught in the tension between faith and feeling, The descent into intimacy was perhaps inevitable. The affair, they became lovers. Abelard moved into Fulbert's home under the guise of full-time tutor. It was, in truth, the perfect cover. In his own words, "We were united in one house before we were united in one heart." Their affair was filled with the intensity of forbidden love. They shared books, letters, and glances that no one else could decode. They composed verses for one another, Abelard in Latin, Heloise in French. Their love was passionate, poetic, and private, but not for long. Heloise became pregnant. This was not just scandalous, it was explosive. Abelard was a cleric, bound by vows of chastity. Heloise, though not a nun, was a young woman of noble blood. Fulbert, her uncle and guardian, had been betrayed. But Heloise did not flinch. She fled Paris with Abelard and gave birth to a son, named Astrolabe, a name drawn from the stars. They briefly lived outside the city, trying to build a life away from the eyes of judgment. The secret marriage to make peace with Fulbert. Abelard agreed to marry Heloise, but in secret. He feared the scandal would destroy his academic reputation. Heloise opposed the idea. She believed that marriage would only diminish Abelard, tying him down and jeopardizing his future. She did not want to become his burden. "If I preferred love to wedlock, liberty to a chain," she wrote later, "it was because I loved you more." Nonetheless, the marriage went forward quietly. It was conducted in secret, witnessed by a few, and then concealed. Abelard returned to his lectures. Heloise returned to her uncle's home. But Fulbert, bitter and betrayed, began to spread the news. Discovery and revenge as the secret unraveled. Abelard tried to protect Heloise by sending her to the convent at Argentul, not to become a nun, but to stay safe, disguised as one. To Fulbert, this was abandonment. To the church, it looked suspicious. To the gossips of Paris, it was confirmation of everything they suspected. Fulbert acted. One night, a group of men broke into Abelard's chambers. They seized him, overpowered him, and castrated him. The act was brutal, symbolic, and final. The man who had defied the church's moral code, who had lived and loved beyond the boundaries set for him, was punished in the most irreversible way. His career as a cleric was over. His life as a lover, too. Abelard would never again know physical love. The aftermath. Shame fell on everyone. Heloise entered the convent permanently, taking her vows. Abelard retreated into monastic life, later joining the Abbey of St. Denis. Their paths diverged, but their bond and their letters remained. This was not a story of reconciliation. It was a story of transformation, from lovers to penitents, from bodies in passion to minds in exile. Their tragedy did not end with the act of violence, but continued in the silence that followed. And yet, from this silence would come something else: letters, philosophies, and reflections that would echo for centuries. In the chapters to come, we will follow their journey through grief, guilt, and grace, and explore the enduring legacy of two souls bound not by marriage or pleasure, but by the written word. There are moments in every story when the private becomes public, when whispered secrets echo across stone courtyards, and hidden glances become matters of law, violence, and shame. For Abelard and Heloise, the fragile shelter of secrecy shattered quickly, and when it did, it shattered everything. A child in a crisis. When Heloise gave birth to Astrolabe, she and Abelard were already living outside of Paris. The child, named after the instrument used to read the stars, represented more than love. He was proof. Proof of the affair. Proof of betrayal. Proof of scandal. Fulbert, Heloise's uncle and guardian, had once admired Abelard. That admiration turned to betrayal, then to fury. The birth of the child had not only dishonored Fulbert's household, but, in his eyes, made a mockery of his trust. Abelard tried to navigate a delicate middle ground. He offered to marry Heloise, secretly, to restore honor. But the secrecy itself was a problem. It meant that Fulbert's reputation, already damaged, could not be repaired in the public eye. Heloise opposed the marriage entirely. She believed it would only diminish Abelard's standing in the intellectual world. To be a married man with a family was to lose credibility as a philosopher, especially one tied to the church. In her view, she would rather be his mistress than his wife. But Abelard insisted. They married in secret, a marriage denied. Soon after the wedding, Heloise returned to Fulbert's home, pretending that the marriage had never occurred. When questioned, she denied it flatly. This infuriated Fulbert even more. In his eyes, Abelard had seduced his niece, married her in secrecy, and now forced her to lie to cover it up. He felt that Abelard had acted selfishly, choosing his career over the dignity of Heloise. Abelard, sensing the storm building, made a decision. He sent Heloise to the convent at Argentul. where she could live in safety under the guise of entering religious life. Though she had not yet taken vows, the very act of donning the veil deepened the scandal. It gave the appearance that Abelard was discarding her. Gossip and the turning tide. Rumors spread through Paris. Students, clergy, and citizens whispered of the affair between the famous master and his student. In the streets, the name Abelard was no longer spoken with reverence alone. It was accompanied by laughter, by judgment, by scandal. Heloise's reputation, too, began to change. Once praised for her intellect, she was now viewed through the crude lens of medieval morality as a fallen woman, as a source of temptation, even as a seductress. But for Fulbert, whispers were not enough. The attack in the middle of the night, as Abelard slept in his lodgings, a group of hired men broke into his room. They were sent by Fulbert. Their task was not to kill, it was to punish. They castrated him. The act was not just physical violence, it was symbolic. Abelard, the lover and the philosopher, was unmade in a single moment. It was an attack on his body, his identity, his masculinity, and his public image. The brilliant teacher who had once lectured to packed halls could no longer claim moral authority. His voice might still speak, but the man who had once defied the church's codes had now been forcibly returned to its control. Public reaction. The attack shocked Paris. Even those who had whispered behind closed doors were taken aback by the brutality. Fulbert was charged by church authorities and punished, though not severely. Some of the men who had carried out the attack were excommunicated. Others simply disappeared. But Abelard's future had been irrevocably changed. No longer able to serve in his previous roles, he retired from public life. He entered the Abbey of St. Denis. Heloise, meanwhile, remained at Argentoul and eventually took the veil fully, becoming a nun in truth rather than appearance. They were separated by more than walls. They were separated by silence, by shame, and by the crushing weight of reputation. A love disfigured, not destroyed. Despite everything, the bond between them did not vanish. Abelard still thought of Heloise, and in her letters, written years later, she still burned with feeling. The physical love had been taken from them, but a deeper, more enduring intimacy would soon emerge. One of words, of memory, of letters. Before that chapter begins, though, both would endure years of reflection, repentance, and reinvention. When the body breaks, the spirit often retreats. After the brutal attack that left Abelard castrated and Heloise cloistered in a convent, the story of their love could have ended, but it didn't. It simply changed its form, from physical to spiritual, from spoken to written, from shared presence to shared absence. Life after the fall. Abelard entered the Abbey of St. Denis. Though once a proud teacher whose voice filled lecture halls, he now lived under obedience in a monastic cell. There, far from the academic debates of Paris and the bright eyes of Heloise, he began to reflect on his pride, his love, his downfall. For Heloise, the change was even more severe. Still young, perhaps no older than 20, she took the veil at the convent of Argentoul. The world she once knew of learning, conversation, and desire narrowed into silence, ritual, and prayer. But her faith was never truly in the cloister. As she would later write, "I would rather be your whore than any emperor's wife." Her heart remained elsewhere. The cloistered life. Medieval convents were not prisons, but they were enclosed worlds. Women rose before dawn, chanted psalms in stone chapels, worked in gardens, copied manuscripts, and lived under strict rules of poverty, chastity, and obedience. There was no comfort in the cloister, not physical, and not emotional. The silence was not peaceful, it was heavy. For Heloise, it was suffocating. Her entry had not been a choice of calling, but of circumstance, and the love she had known was now labeled sin. Abelard, too, found no peace at St. Denis. He clashed with the other monks, who resented his intellect and his fame. He wrote theological treatises, but they were often controversial. In time, he would be accused of heresy. Their bodies were apart, but their minds still burned. The first years passed in quiet agony. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived. It was from Heloise. She had read a new writing of Abelard's, his Historia Calamitatum, the story of my misfortunes. In it, he told of their affair, the attack, and his spiritual journey. But he had written of her more as a chapter in his downfall than as a woman he had loved. Heloise wrote to him, not with reverence, but with a fierce, almost desperate honesty. "How can you speak of our past as if it were merely a source of shame?" she asked. "Do you not remember the joy we shared? The love that was ours before guilt poisoned it?" It was a letter not of nostalgia, but of protest. Guilt, grace, and distance. Abelard responded carefully. His tone was colder than hers. He urged her to embrace her spiritual life, to let go of the past. but the undertone was unmistakable. He remembered, too. He felt the loss. He still loved her, perhaps not as he once had, but in a different, more pained way. Their letters continued. Each exchange revealed a deepening divide between their paths. Heloise still longed for the man she had loved in body and spirit. Abelard, shamed and broken, now saw himself as a penitent. He wanted forgiveness, not passion, but the letters gave them both something, a space to speak freely, even if they no longer agreed, a place where memory could live and grief could breathe, two lives in parallel. Heloise eventually became the abbess of a new convent, the Paraclete, founded by Abelard himself. Though they never met again in person, she led her community using the rule of life he wrote. Their paths diverged, yet remained strangely intertwined. Abelard continued to teach from monasteries and was repeatedly condemned by church authorities. He was brilliant, but never at peace. He sought truth and kept finding rejection. They both grew old under vows they had not chosen freely, and though their love had once caused scandal, it had now become something quieter, something harder to define. Conclusion: the shape of silence. Separation did not end their story, it reshaped it. Their silence was not empty, it was filled with longing, with questions, with the pain of knowing what could have been. In cloisters far apart, under different roofs and rules, they kept writing, they kept remembering, and in doing so, they became something more than lovers. They became symbols of intellect in tension with faith, of desire in conflict with duty, and of a bond that could not be broken, even when it could no longer be lived. In the next part, we will step deeper into their correspondence and hear their voices not as mythic figures, but as human beings writing into the night, seeking not salvation, but understanding. In the silence of their separation, words became their only bridge. No longer lovers in body, Abelard and Heloise became something rarer, companions in exile, writing not just to remember but to wrestle with what remained between them. Their letters, exchanged over years, reveal one of the most honest, painful, and profoundly human correspondences in medieval history. A voice returns. It was Heloise who wrote first, responding to Abelard's public account of his life, the Historia Calamitatum. She had read his confession not just of sin, but of misfortune. But what stung her most was how lightly he treated their love. She did not see herself as a footnote in his downfall. She was his equal, his beloved, and still his wife. In her first letter, she wrote, "You owe me more than silence, more than forgetfulness. I have given you my body, my soul, and my name." It was a letter not of longing alone, but of rebuke. She refused to be erased. The echo of emotion. Abelard's replies were measured, theological, and restrained. He urged her to focus on her spiritual duties. He spoke of sin, penance, and salvation. But between the lines, emotion flickered. He reminded her of their vows, not of marriage, but of monasticism. They had both chosen God. Their past love, he suggested, was part of the suffering they must now bear. But Heloise pushed back. She confessed gently, but boldly, that her prayers were empty, her psalms sung without faith. "I do not seek Christ, but you. Even in the chapel, it is your name I whisper." This was not heresy, it was honesty. She could not pretend her heart had changed just because her habit had. Love, rewritten as intellect as their letters deepened. The passion of their early love transformed into something else, something rarer. They debated ethics, doctrine, free will. Heloise questioned the church's teaching on marriage, on gender roles, on consent. Abelard, always the teacher, responded with long explanations drawn from scripture and the church fathers. Yet there was admiration in his tone. She was not just his former lover, she was now his student and rival in thought. This was intellectual intimacy, a bond no act of violence could break. Their letters revealed a love that had matured, no longer seeking the body, but craving understanding, truth, and recognition, regret, and what cannot be undone. And still, the past lingered. Heloise often returned to that night, the night he was attacked. She blamed herself. If she had insisted on staying away, if she had not denied the marriage, would he still be whole? Abelard, in turn, expressed guilt for leading her into scandal, for letting his pride blind him, for failing to protect her from the church and her own family. These were not just romantic regrets, they were spiritual. Both questioned whether their suffering was punishment toward the natural result of loving too much, too freely, in a world that did not allow it. A dialogue unlike any other. What makes their letters so enduring is not their love alone, but their honesty. These were not idealized saints. They were flawed, brilliant, hurt human beings, trying to rebuild themselves. Through language, Heloise asked, again and again, if she was wrong to still love him. Abelard never truly answered. Instead, He kept writing. Their letters are full of unanswered questions, half-healed wounds, and the ache of distance. But in the spaces between words, something miraculous remained. Presence. Across ink and parchment, they were still with each other. Conclusion. Letters that never let go. The love of Abelard and Heloise did not end in a convent or a monastery. It lived on in our letters filled with memory, wit, theology, pain, and something like grace. To them, we hear not just to medieval voices, but to eternal ones still searching for meaning, still trying to forgive, still loving, even when love could no longer be spoken aloud. Their words remind us that connection can survive distance, that intimacy can exist without touch, that sometimes the most enduring love stories are written, not lived. In the final part, we will follow their last years and explore how, in death, they came to rest side by side, united at last, not in sin or scandal, but in memory. Not all love stories end with reunion. Some linger in absence, in words left behind, in graves that rest side by side. For Abelard and Heloise, the years wore on quietly. No more scandal, no more letters, just the slow passage of time, and a love that transformed into legend. Years apart, yet never distant, Abelard continued his life as a monk and teacher. Though he was no longer the radiant mind of Paris, his theological writings stirred controversy, and he was condemned for heresy late in life. He eventually retired to the priory of Saint Marcel, where he died in 1142 at around age 63. Heloise, now abbess of the Paraclete, ruled her convent with wisdom, strength, and quiet melancholy. She preserved Abelard's letters and writings, ensuring that their correspondence and their truth would not be forgotten. Her leadership was respected, her piety praised, but in her own words, she never ceased to grieve, never ceased to remember. I would rather be miserable with you than happy without you. She died 22 years later, in 1164, a final reunion. In death, before his death, Abelard had expressed a wish to be buried at the Paraclete, the abbey he had founded, and where Heloise served. After her passing, she was laid to rest beside him, just as she had once rested in his arms, their bones, side by side. No church tribunal could separate them now, no canon law, no scandal, no shame. In silence, they had come together again, not as philosopher and student, monk and nun, but as two souls united in something that even time could not undo. Memory, myth, and meaning. The letters of Abelard and Heloise survived. They were copied, debated, and translated over centuries. Some scholars questioned their authenticity, others tried to sanitize them. But the raw emotion of their words, their honesty, their sorrow, their desire, could not be erased. Their story inspired poems, plays, operas, and novels. Voltaire called it the greatest love story of the Middle Ages. Romanticists saw them as martyrs of feeling. Modern readers see them as something more human, too brilliant, flawed people caught in a world that could not contain them. Père Lachaise, a place of pilgrimage in the 19th century. Their remains were moved to Paris's Père Lachaise cemetery, a leafy resting place for writers, artists, and dreamers. Today, their joint tomb stands beneath a Gothic canopy, surrounded by carved stone and roses. Lovers leave notes, flowers, and quiet prayers. Some believe that if you visit their grave and ask for guidance and love, their spirits will listen. What began in whispers now echoes through history. Conclusion. A love that grew beyond itself. Abelard and Heloise were never able to live out the life they imagined. No home, no shared mornings, no growing old together. And yet, their love endured in a form few ever reach, not physical, not even fully romantic, but profoundly eternal. Through suffering, through silence, through exile and ink, they left behind something stronger than reputation. They left truth. Their story tells us that love, when stripped of the body, can still speak, that even in failure, beauty remains, and that sometimes, the greatest intimacy is not in touch, but in the courage to be known. There is a strange kind of silence in a medieval church. Stone arches, flickering candles, the distant chant of a choir. But beneath the solemn prayers and gilded altars lay something far more intimate. Handwritten guides, tucked into priests' collections, that outlined with startling detail what could and could not happen in the bedroom. These were not sermons, they were penitentials, quiet, detailed, and sometimes shocking manuals of sin and consequence. And they reveal more than rules. They uncover a world where sexuality was scrutinized with holy precision. What are penitentials? Penitentials, from Latin penitentia, meaning repentance, were books written primarily between the 6th and 12th centuries to help priests assign appropriate penance for sins confessed in private. They were often small in size, copied by hand, and full of formulas. If a man sleeps with his wife on a Sunday, fast for 3 days. If he does so during Lent, 7 years. If the act brings pleasure, and not just intent to reproduce, more years still. Each act, no matter how private, was given a spiritual weight. It wasn't enough to confess you had sinned. You had to explain how, when, and even in what position. Sex as moral math. These manuals were deeply specific. They functioned like moral accounting. Ledgers. Intercourse outside marriage. 5 years fasting sex in daylight. 40 days fasting use of contraception. 10 years masturbation. 7 years oral sex. 15 years more if repeated. What is striking is not only the detail, but the assumption of universal guilt. Sexual desire, no matter how natural, was always framed as something to manage, suppress, or punish. Why so detailed? The medieval church saw the body as a battlefield where the soul could be lost through the flesh. Priests needed help navigating this vast field of sin. Penitentials offered that guidance. But why such obsession with sexual sin? Because it was everywhere, and it was impossible to fully control. So the church did what institutions often do. It created systems. It categorized. It measured. If sin could be named, it could be taxed in penance. The body became a kind of moral bureaucracy. The role of the confessor. Imagine kneeling before your parish priest. You're not just admitting that you broke a commandment. You're being asked what day it was, what time, who was involved, what happened. The confessor became not only a spiritual guide, but an interrogator. These conversations, written about in chilling calmness, often blurred the line between spiritual care and sexual policing. The power dynamic was immense. The priest had access to your private acts and the authority to define how much suffering they were worth. Gender and judgment. Women often bore heavier spiritual consequences. A wife who denied her husband could be accused of sin, but if a woman asked for sex too often, she could be labeled impure. Widows who expressed desire were viewed with suspicion. Female pleasure was almost never acknowledged as legitimate. The assumption, women were either temptresses or vessels of obligation, and their bodies were ruled by laws written by celibate men. Contradictions and quiet resistance. Despite their strict tone, penitentials were often internally inconsistent. What one text punished with 7 years, another might forgive entirely. Regional variations show a church unsure whether to shame or simply contain desire. Some confessors softened the rules, others ignored them. A few communities stopped using penitentials altogether, finding them too harsh or too ridiculous. Whispers in some monasteries suggest that not all priests followed what they preached. In some cases, priests themselves needed to confess the very sins they judged in others. Legacy and shadows. By the 13th century, penitentials began to fade. The church moved toward more standardized canon law, but their influence lingered in confessional practices, in guilt passed down generationally, and in how people thought about their own bodies. These little books, written in candlelight by monks and copied in quiet scriptoria, left a deep imprint on medieval culture. Sex was not private, not free, and never without moral consequence. Conclusion: when the church counted every touch, penitentials did not prevent desire. They didn't even understand it, but they tried to name it, weigh it, and punish it, turning something deeply human into something coldly mechanical. In their strange arithmetic of sin, we glimpse a society where even the quietest moments between two people were overseen by invisible scribes, and for all their sternness, these manuals tell us something simple and sad. In a world full of longing, the greatest fear wasn't sin, it was being known. You might think that medieval monks spent their days in quiet reverence, copying sacred scripture by candlelight, minds fixed on the divine. And yes, many did. But if you look closely, in the margins of those holy pages, you'll find something else. Rabbits jousting with snails, monks with fox tails, knights fighting giant snails, men bending over, exposing themselves to dragons, creatures half human, half flute. Welcome to the strange and whimsical world of medieval marginalia. The wild, often body images that monks secretly doodled in the corners of sacred texts. What is marginalia? Marginalia simply means things in the margin. In medieval illuminated manuscripts, it refers to the small drawings and decorations scribbled outside the main body of text, usually by the same monks who copied the text itself. Sometimes, it was just vines or flowers, but more often, it was something completely unexpected, and occasionally completely inappropriate. Imagine a monk quietly copying the Psalms, and then sketching a naked man riding a giant chicken in the border. Wide mischief. In monasticism, the scriptorium was a place of discipline. Monks spent hours, even days, hunched over parchment, Errors meant starting over. Pages could take weeks to complete. Boredom and fatigue were constant companions. So perhaps the marginalia were simply jokes, a release, a human response to a life of silence and control. Some drawings mock authority. Abbots with donkey ears, bishops chasing women, monks drunk or asleep. Others subvert scripture, placing dancing demons beside the 10 commandments. It's as if the margins became a whisper zone, where the subconscious could speak while the sacred text stayed intact. Eroticism at the edges. Many marginal images are surprisingly sexual. Naked figures bend, twist, or perform strange acts with animals, musical instruments, or each other. Phallic shapes appear as snails, towers, or bizarre weapons. Women ride dragons. Men cradle enormous radishes with suspicious enthusiasm. These were not illustrations for arousal. They were symbols, satire, or sometimes simple vulgarity. But they also reveal that sexuality, though taboo, was never truly repressed. It surfaced at the edges, in humor, in absurdity, in a world of rigid morality. The margins were where bodies returned, symbol or nonsense. Some scholars argue that marginalia served symbolic purposes. Rabbits hunting dogs equals reversal of nature, a world turned upside down naked. Musicians equals vanity and temptation. And grotesque creatures equals reminders of sin and hell. Others suggest it was just nonsense, a visual counterpart to doodling. But even nonsense has meaning. It tells us what people thought about when they weren't thinking about God, and what they thought about was often surprisingly earthy. The case of the fighting snails. Among the strangest recurring images in medieval margins is the knight versus snail motif. Brave knights raising swords against slow, curling gastropods. Interpretations vary. The snail as a symbol of cowardice, a satire of chivalric pride, a subtle mockery of the futility of fighting sin, or maybe monks just thought it was funny. The fact that we don't fully understand these drawings is part of their charm. They invite questions, not answers, and that uncertainty is deeply human. Women and the margins. Female figures appear to, sometimes as saints, sometimes as sorceresses, but often they're shown in ambiguous or sexualized poses. Women ride wolves, hold oversized objects, or participate in strange rituals. Was this misogyny, or fascination, or both? In the margins, gender roles could bend. The forbidden could surface. The sacred and the profane could coexist in the same inch of parchment. Not just monks. Readers respond to in later manuscripts. Marginalia wasn't just made by scribes. Readers added notes, drawings, or jokes centuries later. A page of serious theological commentary might have a crude cartoon added by a bored monk or student decades later. The margin became a kind of public graffiti wall, a place where thought and mischief danced together. It reminds us, history isn't only what was written, it's also what was doodled. Conclusion. The secret life of the page. Medieval marginalia shows us that even in the strictest environments, imagination refuses to stay silent. While the center of the page declared piety and order, the edges whispered laughter, lust, and chaos. In a way, the margins told the truth. Monks were human, faithful, yes, but also tired, curious, flawed, and occasionally obscene. And so, centuries later, we peer into these sacred books not just for the scripture but for the scribbled monsters, rude jokes, and naked flute players hiding just out of sight. Because in those margins, we don't just see medieval monks, we see ourselves. Step into a medieval cathedral, smell the wax, hear the chants echo off the stone. The altar glows with gold and incense, but beneath the solemn beauty, something strange is happening. A priest opens a jeweled box. Inside, a bone, not just any bone, the knuckle of a saint, or perhaps a vial, said to contain the Virgin Mary's milk, a splinter of the true cross, a scrap of Christ's shroud, relics, tiny pieces of holiness, said to connect earth to heaven. But behind the reverence, relics were also something else: power, profit, and sometimes fabrication. What are relics? A relic is a physical object associated with a saint or a sacred event. They came in three categories: first class, body, parts, bones, blood; hair, second class, items the saint touched, clothes, rosaries, walking sticks; third class, things touched to a first or second class relic, like holy souvenirs. In the medieval world, relics were thought to carry real spiritual energy. They could heal the sick, protect a town, drive away demons, validate a church's authority. But they could also attract pilgrims, and pilgrims brought money, a sacred economy. To draw pilgrims, churches needed relics, so they began to compete, advertising not just their holiness, but their miracles. Some relics became legendary. The bones of St. Cuthbert in Durham, the head of St. John the Baptist, though oddly, several churches claimed to have it the holy foreskin. At one point, there were over 12 competing versions across Europe. Pilgrims walked for weeks or months to visit these objects. Along the way, they spent money on food, lodgings, candles, and indulgences. For a town with a good relic, faith meant commerce. Miracles or marketing. Reports of miracles, healings, visions, voices followed certain relics. These stories were recorded in church documents and read aloud to congregants, but not all were spontaneous. Monasteries often commissioned miracle collections to promote their relics. Scribes compiled tales of lame men walking, blind women seeing, storms parted, babies revived. True or not, the stories worked. Pilgrims came. Donations poured in. A shrine with a popular miracle working relic could rival any royal tax. Holiness had a price, and sometimes a script. The question of authenticity. Behind closed doors, many clergy knew the truth. Some relics were real, many were not. The trade in relics was vast. Bones from anonymous graves were passed off as saints. Merchants sold slivers of wood from the true cross by the basketful. Even respected monasteries engaged in quiet forgeries. In one famous case, the Abbey of Glastonbury claimed to discover the bones of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. Conveniently, just when they needed money for repairs, the line between faith and fraud was often blurred. But few dared challenge it. Faith beyond facts. And yet for the average pilgrim, authenticity often didn't matter. Touching the relic brought comfort. Seeing it reminded them of heaven. Even a questionable object could awaken genuine belief. Relics became focal points, places to pray, hope, and imagine the divine breaking through the ordinary. They offered a tangible connection in a world without science, medicine, or certainty. A splinter of the cross in your hand might mean more than a sermon ever could. Relics and control. The church used relics not only to inspire, but to govern. Kings swore oaths on relics. Relics were carried into battle. Some were used in trials as divine lie detectors. Others were paraded through towns to stop plagues or bring rain. To possess a powerful relic was to possess authority, spiritual, social, and political. It meant the saint was on your side, and it discouraged dissent, because to question a relic was to question the saint, and to question the saint was to question the church. Decline and skepticism. By the late Middle Ages, skepticism grew. Reformers like Wycliffe and later Luther denounced the relic trade as superstition, or worse, manipulation. Some relics were burned, others were locked away. The Reformation shattered the economy of pilgrimage in many regions, but the fascination never vanished. Even today, relics are venerated in churches around the world, from splinters of the cross to drops of blood. They remain symbols of longing, of hope, of a desire to touch something eternal. Conclusion. Between heaven and earth, relics sit at the crossroads of belief and business, faith and fraud. They are strange objects, dead bones, faded cloth, and yet they carried the dreams of millions. To the medieval mind, they were not mere memorabilia. They were portals, places where heaven whispered through dust and ash. And even if we doubt their origins today, perhaps the deeper truth still lingers. People have always reached for the sacred, even if they had to buy a ticket to get there. In the silence of medieval stone chapels, orthodoxy reigned. The words of the church were the words of God. Ideas of simplicity, equality, reform. Ideas that threatened the church, not by attacking it, but by daring to exist outside its control. To question them was not only error, it was rebellion, and rebellion, in the medieval world, burned. But beyond the sermons and statutes, in valleys, in hidden rooms, in whispers across borders, other ideas lived. These were the heretics, and their stories reveal a deeper anxiety that haunted the medieval church. Not evil from outside, but disobedience from within. To be a heretic was to choose a path other than the one prescribed. They were often devout, literate, and deeply spiritual, but they saw flaws in the church's wealth, power, and hierarchy. Who were the heretics? The word heretic comes from the Greek heresis, meaning choice. In practice, heretics were not demons or rebels. Some of the most notable movements, Cathars, believed the material world was evil, rejected church sacraments and hierarchy, flourished in southern France. Waldensians advocated for voluntary poverty and reading scripture in vernacular language. Lollards, followers of John Wycliffe, criticized the veneration of saints and translated the Bible into English. They were not atheists, they were reformers, centuries ahead of their time. Why the fear? To the church, heresy was not just spiritual error, it was existential threat. Because if salvation could be found outside the church's sacraments, if scripture could be read without a priest, if communities could thrive without hierarchy or tithes, then the entire structure trembled. Heresy undermined not doctrine, but authority. It asked dangerous questions. Must priests mediate grace? Can a poor preacher be holier than a bishop? Is truth found in Latin or in the heart? The Inquisition to silence those questions. The Church created the Inquisition, an official body tasked with identifying and eliminating heresy, its methods, anonymous accusations, secret trials, psychological pressure, torture. A full military campaign was waged. Cities were sacked. Thousands were slaughtered, believers and non-believers alike. Public penance or execution. A heretic could be your neighbor, your sister, your priest, and silence or refusal to accuse could be taken as guilt. The Inquisition didn't only seek answers, it sought uniformity. The destruction of the Cathars. Some believers traveled in disguise, carrying scripture in their native tongue, which was banned. One of the darkest examples came with the Albigensian Crusade 1209-1229, launched against the Cathars in southern France. Knowledge became dangerous. These heretics were peaceful, ascetic, and rejected violence, but their popularity alarmed Rome. The Church's most infamous command: kill them all. God will know his own. In this campaign, we see the terrifying logic of absolute certainty. Hidden books, hidden words. Fear of heresy created a culture of secrecy. Books were copied in basements. Preachers taught by night. Luther, Calvin, and others would later echo the very concerns voiced centuries earlier. But this time, the Church could no longer suppress them. Even speaking about the Trinity or Eucharist outside official teaching could bring suspicion. And yet, the ideas spread like seeds scattered on wind. The questions asked by heretics took root quietly, in hearts, in texts. In time, from fire to reform, many heretics were silenced. Some burned, others faded. But their legacy endured. By the 14th and 15th centuries, early reformers like Jan Hus and John Wycliffe laid the groundwork for the Reformation. What was once heresy would become doctrine for millions. Conclusion: the fear that preserved the flame. The medieval church feared heresy not because it was false, but because it was compelling. These weren't enemies of God. They were seekers of truth, and in punishing them, the church revealed its own insecurity. Today, the heretics of the past are seen with new eyes, not as rebels, but as visionaries. Their courage to ask questions in a world of unquestionable power is perhaps their greatest miracle. When you walk into a medieval cathedral, your eyes are drawn upward, toward light, stained glass, and visions of saints. But look lower, into the carvings, the corners, the shadows. There, beneath the beauty, the devil waits. He is painted into murals. He is sculpted into pews. He is hidden in manuscript, margins, and carved into the very walls of churches. Why? Because in the medieval world, the devil was not abstract. He was real, near, watchful, and art, slow, vivid, unforgettable, became one of the church's most powerful weapons to show him. Sin in stone. Medieval churches weren't just places of worship. They were visual sermons, open books in stone and glass for a largely illiterate population. Carved capitals atop pillars showed a greedy merchant being dragged to hell, lustful women lured by demons, and monk falling asleep and embraced by snakes, a man whispering to a demon with human eyes. These images weren't hidden. They were meant to be seen, reminders that salvation was fragile, and damnation just one thought away. The devil's many faces. The devil rarely looked the same. He looked like what you wanted most, until it was too late. Sometimes he had horns, sometimes a crown, sometimes a dog's face, or bat wings, or hairy hooves. He could be monstrous, or disturbingly human. This fluidity was deliberate. The devil wasn't just horror, he was temptation, deception, and artists loved to show that moment. The fall, the seduction, the smile that turned sharp. The art of fear. Perhaps the most disturbing images came in doom paintings. Enormous murals placed over church entrances or altar walls. They showed the Last Judgment, Christ above, serene and distant, the saved on his right, calm, clothed, climbing toward heaven, the damned on his left, naked, screaming, dragged by demons into hell. And hell itself was a grotesque theater. Mouths wide enough to swallow cities, demons cooking souls in cauldrons, sinners devoured, pierced, burned, mocked. To medieval eyes, this was reality, a future to be feared, a fate to be avoided at all costs. These were not metaphors. The 7 deadlies illustrated each sin had its imagery. Pride, a knight falling off his horse into hell's jaws. Lust, lovers tangled in flames, unable to part. Greed, a merchant with his eyes pecked by crows, a visual theology built on terror and consequence. Sloth, a monk melting into his bed. Bound by vines, gluttony, a man gorging, then choking, while demons cheer envy. To women tearing each other's hair, step into a church, and you were stepping into a warning. Wrath, soldiers impaled on each other's swords. These weren't just illustrations, they were psychological conditioning. Sacred and scared fear that etched itself into memory. Children grew up with these images. Priests preached beside them. Weddings and funerals happened beneath them. The devil was part of daily life. This was theology. By immersion, not words, but atmosphere. And in that warning, you might become obedient. Was it all fear? Not entirely. And you are always being watched. Some are offered hope, angels guiding souls, saints defeating serpents, Christ raising the dead. But those images were usually smaller, quieter. It was fear that lingered, because if love of God didn't move you, fear of hell just might. The devil within from the edges of the sacred. Ultimately, the medieval church's art of terror reveals a truth more human than theological. The greatest fear is not fire, it's failure. It's being seen, judged, condemned, and left outside the light. So the devil crouched in corners of churches not to scare the wicked, but to remind the faithful, you are never safe. Conclusion, a mirror in the shadows. In those ancient stone monsters, winged demons, and burning souls, we see not just medieval nightmares, but something universal. The need to explain fear, to draw it, name it, shape it. Because once fear is painted on a wall, you can point to it, avoid it, maybe even pray it away. And so the devil stayed, not just in scripture, but in sculpture, not just in warnings, but in art, waiting, watching, and whispering. If you picture medieval life, your mind might go first to mud, famine, and hardship, and for most people, that was true, but not for everyone. There, in castles with tapestries and courtyards, the rich had their own routines, structured, slow, and surprisingly ceremonial. High on a hill, behind stone walls and iron gates, nobles lived another kind of life. But what did they actually do all day? Let us follow a noble, perhaps a lord or a lady, through a single day in a medieval castle. Not a dramatic day, not a war or a wedding, just an ordinary one. Even the shoes are chosen with care. Soft leather indoors, sturdy boots for the courtyard. Morning, awakening with the light there is. No alarm clock, no emails, just the dim light slipping through stained glass. Servants have already been awake for hours, lighting fires, laying out clothes, pouring hot water for washing. A noble does not dress alone. 2, 3, sometimes for attendants' help. Pulling on woolen underlayers, silk over gowns, linen chemists, embroidered cloaks. These are short meetings with estate managers, petitioners, or visiting merchants. Decisions must be made about taxes, land disputes, dowries, repairs to the stables. Nobles rarely drank plain water. It was considered unsafe and, frankly, too common. Breakfast, perhaps some bread, a bit of cheese, maybe wine or ale. Leisure, on parchment, or dictation to a scribe, a reply to a cousin, a letter to the king. And letters learning is expected. They might study Latin, theology, poetry, or law. Others prefer music, playing lute, harp, or recorder. Ladies might practice singing or refine courtly French. This is not a meal for talking. It's a meal for being watched by servants, companions, sometimes guests, too, for leisure. While eating, the noble listens to readings, letters, news, or religious texts, with beautifully carved pieces. Even the simplest things, getting dressed, breaking fast, are small rituals of status. Mid-morning, court and ceremony, but a quiet, meditative practice done in groups. The napkins all symbolic. Servants prepare the bed, thick with wool and furs. The fire burns in the hearth. A storyteller, a performance by a jester. The noble speaks little, but listens closely. By late morning, the noble might hold audiences, the burden of always being seen, and never being quite yourself. And every hour of the day is a chance to invest in it, or ruin it. This is business, but it's also theater. The Lord sits higher than the others. His tone is formal. His words are few, but perhaps, for all its silk and song, it was not so different from a prison, just one made of gold and ritual. They are watched. Nothing a noble does is truly private. If the noble is a lady, her audience may include more domestic matters, arranging marriages for wards, supervising embroidery production, receiving gifts from visiting clergy. Every word is weighed, every look measured. In the medieval elite, reputation is a form of currency. Fish if it's Friday. The granary, the stables, might speak with the steward about harvest forecasts. might visit the chapel, say a private prayer, or meet briefly with the chaplain. Stewed fruits, but by expectation, a noble must appear wise, generous, but also firm. Honeyed vegetables. Late morning, learning. After court, the noble might retreat to a private chamber. There may be writing, with a quill, slowly. For some nobles, there is time. Chess, falconry, if the weather allows. Releasing birds into the wind, standing in fields, waiting for the sky to speak. The noble may walk the grounds. Castles are not just homes, they are small governments. Needlework, not a chore. The noble rides out to survey land, visit a monastery, or inspect a bridge. A short journey becomes a small parade. Guards, companions, dogs, and banners. And all the while, midday, the main meal, dinner, served around noon, is the largest meal of the day. Long tables are set, platters arrive, roast meats, but the food is not the point. The seating is. Who sits where reflects status. Who is served first reflects favor. Who brings the salt, the wine. There may be music. Every motion is part of a performance. Even chewing is done with care. Afternoon, inspection and supervision after the meal. The noble might inspect the kitchens. There may be disputes to settle between servants, between villagers. These are judged not only by fairness. Sometimes, evening, entertainment and reflection as dusk falls. Torches are lit. Another small meal, lighter, less formal. Stew, bread, mulled wine. Afterward, the noble might host guests. They gather in the solar, the warm upper room, to listen to music, poetry, or a reading from a beloved tale. Laughter is allowed, but too much is suspect. Nobles must balance warmth with dignity, joy with restraint. Then, prayers. A candle is lit, and sleep comes, not always easily. The castle is cold, the stone walls echo, but another day has passed. Conclusion, a life of comfort. But not freedom. To be noble in the medieval world was to live with beauty, yes, but also with performance. Everything, waking, eating, speaking, even resting, was watched, weighed, and bound by custom. There were no fields to till, no hard labor, but there was pressure, expectation. A day in the castle was quiet, measured, and full. In the medieval imagination, the table was more than a place to eat, it was a stage. And dining, for nobles, was not just about feeding the body, but performing one's place in the world. Where you sat, how you held your cup, whether you tore your bread or sliced it. These details mattered. Every meal was a rehearsal of status, and every mistake whispered who did not belong. Let's sit at that table now, quietly, without speaking. Let the rhythms of ritual guide us. Preparing the stage, cloths unfurled, usually white, sometimes embroidered with the noble's crest. The closer you are to the salt, the closer you are to power. Farther down the table, you're farther from favor. Hours before the first platter is brought out, the servants begin. Tables are wiped with wine and water. Benches aligned. Knives are cleaned and laid out. Though many guests bring their own forks, rare and even scandalous in some places, eating with fingers is the norm, but not carelessly. There are rules. The salt cellar, a symbol of authority, is placed carefully before the highest-ranking guest. Wooden trenchers are set, round, flat plates shared between two people. Those below wait for a signal to sit. No one eats until the Lord takes the first bite. This is not dinner, it's a ceremony. Then roasted meats, goose, beef, lamb, sometimes swan or peacock skinned, roasted, then redressed in its own feathers for show. The procession begins. Guests enter by rank, the most important first. They do not simply walk to their seats. They are announced. At the high table sits the Lord, or perhaps a visiting abbot or knight. It is a meal, yes, but also a reminder of where everyone stands. What's on the table? The food is elaborate, though not always as delicious as you'd think. First come pottages, thick soups made from grains, root vegetables, and meat. Fish days offer eels, herring, and dried cod, salted, boiled, served with mustard or vinegar. Spiced cakes, soft cheeses, honeyed fruit, sometimes sculpted sugar figures, castles, lions, even saints. Desserts, or subtleties, are not sweet by modern standards. A clumsy gesture could ruin a match. A misplaced napkin might embarrass your house. Wine flows freely, watered down for common guests, richly spiced for the elite. But no one eats all this. It's not about indulgence, it's about display. Manners that meant everything. Medieval etiquette guides were strict, and often poetic. Don't scratch your head or pick your teeth at the table. Don't dip meat into the communal sauce more than once. Don't speak with your mouth full, even if the tale is grand. Always wipe your fingers before touching the salt. If you must spit, use your napkin, never the floor. Children of noble birth were trained from a young age in dining behavior. Grace, restraint, and cleanliness were signals of breeding, not moral virtue, but class. Servers as performers, those who served were not just helpers, they were part of the pageant. The carver was a skilled position, slicing meat with precision and flair. The cupbearer tasted each drink to show loyalty and dispel suspicion of poison. For bread, the taster might sample the food first, especially if political tension simmered. For as diplomacy for meat, who sat beside the host mattered more than what was served. Inviting someone to dine in private was a mark of trust, or fracture it, excluding them. A message heard loud and clear. Excess might be given to monasteries or distributed through almsgiving. And fish wine, a poem, a riddle, perhaps a visiting fool, mocking the guests gently, never too harshly, unless he wanted to be dismissed. And through it, the medieval elite told the world who they were. Their grace was expected to match the nobility they served. Some nobles had entire households of specialists for meals, sauciers for spices. Observers watched who shared trenchers, who refilled whose cup. Marriage deals, military campaigns, even betrayals, all began over roast duck and red wine. Pantlers, butlers, larders, and control, all moved in silence. Dining meals were more than sustenance. They were political events. The meal seating could signal alliances or punishments. At the royal court, a feast could forge a bond. Conversation paused. Giving, like eating, was public and performative. What happened to the leftovers? You might imagine nobles wasted food, and yes, some did, but often. But drunkenness was frowned upon, especially for women and clergy. Nobles were expected to enjoy, but with measured dignity. Leftovers were carefully redistributed. Bread scraps went to the poor at the gate. Bones were boiled for stew by servants. Even generosity became ritual, part of the noble's image. After there might be music, wine flowed again. Eventually, the lord would stand, a sign that the meal had ended. Others stood with him, and the ritual closed. Conclusion: dining as a mirror of power. To eat as a noble was not to eat freely. It was to be watched, to become part of a living tableau where every action echoed status, grace. The food, the guests, the silence between courses, all formed a vocabulary. But beneath the gold platters and the lace-trimmed sleeves, one truth remained. The meal was not for hunger, it was for order. Step into a medieval hall of mirrors. If mirrors were polished metal and beauty a matter of duty, among nobles, how you looked wasn't simply a matter of taste. It was a message, a mask, and a kind of armor. Clothes spoke, hairstyles whispered, perfumes covered silence, and beneath every layer, fur, silk, gem, was a quiet truth. You were what you wore. Dressing for rank in a time before logos or social media. Fabric was the filter. Only certain people could wear certain materials. Ermine and sable were reserved for royalty and high clergy. Purple was for kings, or those granted permission. Scarlet wool, expensive and imported, marked wealth and power. A merchant's wife might be richer than a baroness' daughter, but she couldn't dress like one. Status came before silver. They defined the boundaries of class. Sumptuary laws dictated fashion. Clothes didn't just warm the body. The art of getting dressed in noble's mourning began not with action, but with adornment. Layers were built like armor. A linen shift next to the skin, a fitted kirtle or tunic over that, then the gown, fur-lined, embroidered, often trailing the floor. A knight's cloak could sweep behind him like a banner. Finally, belts, brooches, gloves, rings, and headdress. A lady's headdress might stretch over a foot wide, and the shoes, pointed, curled, sometimes stuffed with moss to keep shape. To walk was to perform. Bathing, cleanliness, and contradiction. Forget the myth. Medieval people did bathe. Nobles, especially, valued ritualized hygiene, even if their idea of clean differed from ours. Baths were elaborate. A wooden tub lined with linen, hot water poured by servants. Herbs like rosemary or lavender floated on top. Musicians might play nearby. Wine or spiced milk was served as one soaked scent became a solution. Baths were often social, shared between spouses, or among noble ladies. Some even discussed politics mid-soak, but bathing too often, that raised suspicion. Excessive cleanliness could be read as vanity, or, worse, moral weakness. Perfume, powder, and painted faces and clove oil. Since full body washing wasn't daily, popular perfumes included ambergris from whale bile, wealth, no sun, no labor, musk from deer glands, rosewater. Makeup followed strict codes. Pale skin equals purity, was used, it was duty, especially for women. Beauty was proof of good breeding. To bleach freckles, red cheeks, and lips equals vitality. Berries, stained, it was compliance. Lips fashion. But under the silks and scents, there was often something else: pressure, a fear of falling out of favor. Fashion and hygiene became tools of expression and submission, of being deemed improper, unattractive, or uncouth, and watchers and critics became held your goblet. The body became a kind of script, and every movement was part of the performance. Adjusted your sleeves was evaluated. Etiquette books even instructed how to scratch your nose politely. To French might be mocked or mistrusted. Politics and nails often handheld, but nobles didn't need mirrors to know how they looked. Darkened eyebrows equals beauty and boldness. Church officials condemned. Exposed hair, even shoes were controversial. The poulains long, curled footwear were seen as signs of decadence. In some regions, their length was regulated by class and loneliness. To achieve this, lead-based powders were applied to whiten the skin. Vinegar crushed, ash mixed with wine cleaned teeth, sort of. This was not for fun, when what you wore could cost you. And the inner self, a lady who dressed above her station risked shaming her family. A young lord whose boots were too soft, too pointed. Kings issued laws about sleeve length. Appearance was tied to marriage. Smiled when tired, stood still when itching. Suffered in silence beneath jeweled veils. Security and survival. A bad first impression could echo for decades. Looking right wasn't vanity. Mirrors, actual mirrors, were rare. Polished bronze or glass backed with silver. They had attendance, every gesture, how you sat. For the elite, beauty. It's easy to imagine these nobles as vain, for noble women especially, so they whitened their skin. Because beauty, in the medieval court, was not about feeling beautiful. It was about being seen as worthy. Conclusion: the body as language in a world of hierarchy and silence. The noble body was a surface, polished, powdered, perfumed, but rarely allowed to speak. And so the sleeves grew longer, the shoes sharper, the faces paler. Not because the nobles didn't know who they were, but because the world only listened to what they wore. In medieval courts, love was sung by troubadours, written in velvet-bound letters, and whispered behind fans. But in the chambers of nobles, behind thick walls and colder bedsheets, love was not a promise. It was a negotiation. Marriage, among the elite, had little to do with affection, and everything to do with land, lineage, and leverage. Desire was a minor concern. Obligation came first. Let's step quietly into this world, where alliances were sealed in silk, where girls became wives at 12, where intimacy was ranged and sometimes avoided altogether. A girl might be betrothed by age 5, especially if her dowry, land, gold, or titles could secure a family standing. Childhood and betrothal for noble children. Marriage was decided long before desire could form. These matches were not private affairs. They were strategic contracts. Strengthen ties between noble houses, settle political feuds, acquire disputed land, secure royal favor. A daughter was a tool, a currency, a pledge. Her value was measured in acres and alliances, not feelings. The marriage itself might not happen until age 12 or 14, but by then, the path was already paved. The wedding, ceremony and spectacle. The noble wedding was a grand performance, but not for the bride and groom. Rings placed, though not always. Sometimes a clasp of hands, or the signing of a contract, was enough. It was for witnesses, for signatures, for legacy. The day began with a procession, gifts exchanged, oaths recited. Even reluctant brides were married with little resistance, as long as the dowry was in order. If a woman did not conceive within the first year, whispers began, remedies were tried, blame assigned, often to her. The church oversaw the ritual, but rarely questioned the politics behind it. Public and awkward, it involved guests escorting the couple to the marriage bed, offering toasts, songs, sometimes even staying to witness the sheets being drawn. After the vows came the bedding ceremony. In this world, privacy was a luxury. A marriage wasn't real until it was consummated, and someone had to make sure it was. Sex as duty, not passion. Among the nobility, sex within marriage was less about pleasure than about continuity. A noble couple's first goal: produce heirs, ideally sons. The pressure was intense. Then, you were expected to lie in it for life. Intimacy itself followed a pattern. Kings kept mistresses openly. Knights had dalliances with ladies in waiting. Some women, too, found affection elsewhere, discreetly. Intercourse was expected, but not discussed. Positions were prescribed, often missionary only. The church forbade sex on holy days, which meant nearly half the year, but in reality, they were often tense, risky, and unequal. Pleasure, especially for women, was rarely acknowledged. Love could grow over time, but many unions were cold, distant, or even hostile, and yet a divorce was nearly impossible. You made your bed, Affairs and acceptable transgressions. Even wealthy widows were often forced to remarry by their male relatives, especially if land or titles were involved. Despite the rules, extramarital relationships were common, especially among noblemen. The key was discretion. A few marriages began as contracts but deepened into companionship over time. As long as reputations were preserved, affairs could be tolerated, sometimes even expected, if they did not produce scandal or illegitimate claims to property. In courtly love literature, these romances were idealized: secret glances, coded poems, gestures across ballrooms. Love, if it came at all, had to hide women, inheritance, and the invisible hand. For noble women, marriage was not escape, it was transfer, from the authority of father to husband. In some cases, a woman became a bargaining chip not once, but 3 or 4 times, married off repeatedly as alliances shifted. Those who resisted, they risked excommunication, property seizure, isolation. Some entered convents to avoid remarriage, not always out of piety, but to reclaim a sliver of autonomy, the personal within the political. And yet, not all was bleak. Some couples grew fond. Some letters between spouses show warmth, humor, even intimacy. But these were exceptions, and, even in such cases, the power dynamics remained unequal. Love had to fit inside the contract, not the other way around. Conclusion: behind the veil of lace and law in the world of noble marriage, the heart came second, maybe third, sometimes not at all. Behind the music and the feasts, 2 young people, often strangers, were asked to bind their lives for reasons they didn't choose. Some found peace, some found silence, some found nothing, and so the bed stayed cold, the contract stayed sealed, and love waited at the door. Among the nobility, death was not simply the end, it was a transition, a message, a mirror held up to life. To die poorly, without witnesses, without preparation, was a shame. But to die beautifully, with your lineage secured, your soul confessed, and your legacy intact, that was the final performance. Let's step gently into the quiet corridors of this last ritual, where candles burn low, linen is folded carefully, and silence is as meaningful as words. Long before their final breath, nobles prepared for it, sometimes for decades, preparing for the end. For the rich, death rarely came as a surprise. It began with the will, land distributed among children, jewelry allocated to specific heirs, donations assigned to churches, hospitals, monasteries, instructions for burial, including tomb design and wording of epitaphs. These weren't acts of fear, but investments in eternity. Many nobles also paid for masses in advance, dozens, even hundreds, to be said for their souls after death. Dying well started long before dying. No screaming, no fear, only peace, if possible. The final days, ritual and reverence. As the end drew near, the room darkened, curtains drawn, fires kept low. The deathbed was a stage, and the audience would remember the final act. Bells rang across cities. Heralds were sent to announce the death in neighboring regions. Black cloth draped over gates and chapels. A priest was summoned to administer the last rites, confession, anointing, and the Eucharist. Relics might be placed in the dying person's hands. Psalms whispered. Family gathered, not to weep, but to watch. A noble should die with dignity, lying still, forgiving enemies, blessing children. Sometimes, professional scribes recorded the final words, a legacy not just of land, but of wisdom. The funeral, a pageant of grief. It was about affirming lineage, identity, and divine favor. Death did not end with death. It only widened. Rich nobles commissioned monumental tombs, stone effigies carved in likeness, often placed in the center of chapels or beneath painted ceilings. For the wealthy, funerals lasted days, even weeks. The body was washed, perfumed, and dressed, often in religious robes or ceremonial armor, laid in an open casket, watched over, night and day. Then came the procession. Mourners dressed in black, horses draped in velvet, priests chanting, paid mourners, women hired to cry publicly, loudly, beautifully. It was theater, but it was also catharsis. A noble funeral wasn't just about loss. Medieval theology taught that charitable acts cleansed the soul, especially when done in view of death. Tombs that spoke forever. Burial was not simple. Some were realistic, hands folded, eyes closed, bodies armored. Others were dual effigies. She would dress in black for a year or more, eat simply, speak softly. The upper sculpture showed the noble, in life, calm, dressed. Idealized. The lower one showed their decaying corpse, skin sunken, bones exposed, worms crawling across. These cadaver tombs weren't morbid. They were messages. You too shall die, even in death. Nobles taught lessons. Death as redemption. Many nobles feared judgment. No amount of gold could buy salvation. But they tried. They founded hospitals, monasteries, schools in their name, paid for bridges and roads, gave alms, commissioned prayers, not always out of guilt, often out of duty. And so, the dying rich did good, with purpose and calculation. The widow and the legacy. A nobleman's death reshaped his entire household. His widow might retire to a convent, or manage the estate if trusted, though often, male relatives took over. Children were mourning. 2 songs were forbidden in a home, mirrors sometimes covered. But the legacy continued. The tomb was visited, the masses said, and the family name carried forward, heavier now, burdened with memory. Conclusion: a quiet crown to die well, for the noble, was the final show of status. It was not about the soul alone, but about being remembered correctly. Because in a world of hierarchy and performance, even death had form. And so, the noble slipped away, between psalms and candlelight, beneath silk and stone, not into silence, but into lasting visibility. A beautiful death, after all, was the only way to stay alive.